Well, Brandon Woodruff is going to be back in Milwaukee for another season. The Brewers not making any non-tender decisions. So for now, everybody who's arbitration eligible is coming back. And Pat Murphy and Matt Arnold running it back for Manager of the Year and Executive of the Year during awards season. So a lot of status quo or repeats, I guess, that we're talking about this week on the Brewer Fanatic podcast. Jack Stern joined by Spencer Michaelis. Not a ton to get to this week. Like I said, just some housekeeping stuff. But before we dive into any of that, I am required by the fine print in our podcasting agreements to ask Spencer how he's doing.
Yeah, I made sure to get that in there when we signed up for this. But I'm doing pretty well. I made us record a little bit later than initially planned because of the Badger game. Did not go well. Definitely could have just recorded and missed it. Would have had no issue missing that game. But otherwise, things have been good. And yeah, I'm looking forward to talking about the status quo with the Brewers because that's kind of what we expected. We talked about last time and really since the season ended that we're not expecting a ton of movement. And I think this really kind of points to that being the case. But we'll find out as the offseason continues and we'll talk about all of it. But yeah, otherwise, besides the Badgers, things have been great. How are you, Jack?
I'm doing all right. We can jump into this stuff here. I am getting a little bit I don't know if bored is the word yet, but I feel like once we get into December, like that's really the month where I feel like the baseball stuff really starts to slow down even more because we've kind of gotten past these first couple days, and especially with the way that things tend to work now in the offseason, there's a lot more action late than early. So it might slow down here and we might hit a little bit of a dead patch when we get into December. So I'm not super excited about that. But otherwise, I'm happy with where things are at right now. So we can jump into the couple of items to talk about this week. We'll start with Brandon Woodruff accepting that qualifying offer. We had talked about this a couple of weeks ago on the last show after the Brewers extended that offer out there. We both said that we felt that that increased the likelihood that Brandon Woodruff was going to come back because it seemed hard to believe that he was going to be able to beat that 22.025 million that he's guaranteed now for 2026 in any multi-year deal that he would pursue if there was a multi-year deal out there. I know some of like the leading projections had him kind of in that 360 million range. I'm a little skeptical that teams would have been lining up to pay him that, but even so, like you are still talking about probably a tick below what he's going to make in 2026 now, which is going to make him the highest paid starting pitcher for any season in franchise history. So not total guarantee, obviously, but that annual salary for 2026 is going to be the most that the Brewers have ever paid a starting pitcher in franchise history. And Woodruff did point to that when he spoke to a couple reporters in the aftermath of making that decision. He said, I know the ramifications of offering 1 year and 22 million to a pitcher in the Brewers organization. That has never happened, so I don't take that lightly. And then he also said that it was a pretty easy decision to come back, especially because, like he said, it's 22 million. You know, he didn't. I don't think he necessarily felt like he was in a huge position to walk away from that, especially from an organization that he has spent his entire career playing for. He likes the organization. There's a good relationship here, and we've talked about all that stuff too. Just a lot of things I think pointing to a decent chance of bringing him back. And then I think once that offer was thrown out there, we kind of agreed like it would probably be in his best interest to take that offer. So that's how things panned out. He's going to be back for another season, and he'll slot in presumably right behind Freddie Peralta in that rotation. And we can talk a little bit about kind of what may or may not happen there. But first, do you have any reactions to hearing the news that Brandon Woodruff is, like we expected, coming back and he's going to pitch for the Brewers in 2026?
Yeah, just as a fan, I mean, I was happy. I've talked about it on here a number of times, especially as we kind of went through the build up this past year or so into expectations for Woodruff and what we might see from him when he returned, just how much I've always been a huge fan of Woodruff. Like this is for me, it's probably one of my top 2 or 3 Brewers of all time, just in terms of guys I like rooting for and guys I enjoy watching play and what he's done for the Brewers when he's been healthy. And obviously the last couple of years have been tough. And he he came back and he performed when he was on the field this past season, but it then ended in an injury again, and we didn't see him in the playoffs, and that was obviously not what he was hoping for or what anyone was hoping for. But to see him back and to know that the Brandon Woodruff experience in Milwaukee is not done it's just a positive for me as a fan. And then from a baseball perspective, like, this is a guy who, like I just said, he performed when he was out there in 2025, and he performed really well. Like, honestly, quite a bit better than I expected, or I think we both tried to kind of hedge against those expectations and trying to make sure that people weren't going to expect that out of him. And then he still went out and did it. We talked last episode about the possibility that, and in my mind, maybe the likelihood that the Brewers and obviously their training staff and everyone else feel very good about him health wise right now if they're extending him this offer. And to me, that means I'm not expecting, but I think there's a pretty decent chance that there is an extra tick or two back on the fastball next year. I would not be surprised at all if that's the case, if the stuff plays up a little bit more than it did in his return. And even if it doesn't, and he talked about this a little bit when he spoke to the media or when he spoke with some of the reporters, like, he doesn't need it. He doesn't need to have the stuff tick back up. It's just an extra positive if it does, because he's learned how to pitch with some diminished stuff from where he was previously. But if it does tick back up, then it's just an extra positive that adds on to what he can already do with the new repertoire he's working with the cutter, with just some of the changes to some of the pitch shapes and everything else. But adding a couple ticks back would go a really long way towards making it even more difficult on hitters. And then the final question is, can we get a mostly healthy season out of Brandon Woodruff? I think it would be dangerous to expect him to go out and just never miss a start or never have starts skipped next year or something. At least, like, if he doesn't hit the IL at any point next year, I'd imagine it'll be in part due to them helping him through the season with, there's a lot of starting depth in the Brewers organization right now, and especially in AAA and at the major league level, they have a lot of options. We got a question kind of along those lines. So they will probably be able to find ways to build in what we talked about with, like, Miz towards the end of the season. But for a guy like Woodruff, building in a skip start or building in an extra day of rest or any of those things just to help him get through a long season, assuming he stays healthy in general, that's obviously the next step. I think the thing everyone wants to see from Woodruff now is him back on a playoff mound. We've seen him return in the regular season, pitch really well, but we've also seen what he can do in the playoffs and his ability to kind of step up in those moments. And you never know how it's going to go. I mean, guys have off games. You can have a bad start, and in the playoffs, everyone's going to remember that. But he has shown an ability to show up in those moments. So I think that's the next thing that we're hoping to see from him, obviously, in his return this year. And hopefully that would mean a return to the playoffs for the Brewers as well.
So we know that Brandon Woodruff is going to be presumably on the roster in 2026. He's going to be lined up to pitch for them. So that answers one question about how things are going to look for him and how they're going to look for the Brewers. But now that he is back, I think that raises more questions now. Number one is some of the stuff that you touched on. What exactly is it going to look like, and how often is he going to be on the mound? And again, I think the way that this unfolded, especially with the Brewers throwing that offer out there, probably knowing there was a very good chance he was going to take it, I do, kind of like we said last week, I think that points to a lot of optimism on their part that he's going to be in a very good spot next year. And I would probably agree with that. I think the fact that he was, like you said, able to still get guys out this year, throwing anywhere from 90 to 94, and then you add maybe another couple ticks onto that and just better health as he's further removed from that surgery, I think that all bodes pretty well for him. The other questions then are obviously how this impacts the rest of the pitching depth, because now it kind of slides everybody down a spot again, where probably now that only spot that's up for grabs as things currently stand is that fifth starter spot, because then you've probably got Mizorowski just about locked into a spot with what he did in the playoffs last year. You've got Priester locked into a spot. So now it's probably more down to a lot of guys competing for one gig as opposed to maybe two or even three spots. And then I think the final question here is, it does come back to Freddie Peralta again, because now you look at where the Brewers are at payroll wise. They are going to, at this stage, assuming that all of their arbitration eligible players end up right around what the projections are, and assuming that they don't do anything to shed salary, they are going to enter the season with a payroll of about 135 million, and they've been over that mark before, but usually not to start the season. Usually that's a spot where they end up after they've taken on some additional expenses throughout the year. Maybe they took on a contract at the trade deadline, but they rarely start at 135 million like they're projected to going into 2025 or 2026, excuse me. So naturally, all of a sudden, a lot of the speculation comes back to, well, now do they trade Freddie Peralta to free up that $8 million that he's supposed to make next year on that option? And Matt Arnold and Mark Ananasio both said in separate text messages to The Athletic that those are independent decisions. So Brandon Woodruff coming back has nothing to do with what they're going to do with Freddie Peralta. And I'll get your thoughts on this, but I'm inclined to largely take that at face value because, yes, the Brewers are now on the hook for more money going into the year than they almost always are. But, and I was asked this a couple days ago. I was on Locked On Brewers, and this was something that came up. And I think the other part of this you need to think about is they probably weren't going to spend much money at all this offseason anyway, just because there's going to be so much continuity and so many guys coming back. I mean, almost the entire roster is going to be under club control again in 2026. So this was probably not going to be an offseason where they felt the need to make a bunch of moves and do all this kind of stuff. And I think that plays into the decision too, to put that qualifying offer out there, knowing, I mean, are they really going to use that 22 million anywhere else? Were they really going to use that 22 million anywhere else? I do think that if a certain situation pops up and they get an offer for Freddie Peralta that they maybe would have previously been right on the fence about, with Brandon Woodruff back in that mix, does it maybe make it more likely that at that point you actually do make the jump there and you kind of take like an offer that you were kind of leaning on, like it was a good enough offer, but maybe you had some trepidation over, well, can we really get rid of a clubhouse guy like Freddie, get rid of the production of Freddie? Maybe now they're willing to take one more step like that if they have Brandon Woodruff back and they feel good about what he's going to provide on and off the field. But I do think for the most part that this is not going to be something that drastically alters the way that they expected their offseason to go, whether that's spending in free agency, whether it's Freddie Peralta's future. Again, I really think the only impact it might have is if you get one of those kind of borderline offers where it's good enough to really make you think about it. And maybe that does tip them one direction if they're leaning as opposed to another one now that they have a little more depth. And it's a veteran guy who's been in the organization for as long as Woodruff has.
Yes, someone asked me on Twitter right after it broke that he was accepting the offer, something similar, and I basically echoed that. Like I don't think it changes the likelihood of Peralta getting traded. I think they're going to continue to keep their asking price very high, and they're going to shoot for that price. And if they don't get it, they're going to be more than happy to keep him and slot him into their rotation. And him and Woodruff will be your top two starters heading into the season. Like they'll be happy and they'll be in a very good place if they do that. But I do think they were always going to entertain offers that, like we've talked about a number of times, probably push the line of being a quote unquote overpay or just something that it's just an offer that's too good to refuse from the Brewers' perspective for 2026, but also for however many years they get of control in the return. And that's always going to be the line that they have to walk. And I think what you're saying, and I agree with, is I think this makes it a little bit easier to potentially walk that line if the right trade comes across. Like it was always going to be difficult to say Woodruff's gone and now you trade Freddie, and to really believe or look at the starting rotation, which has a ton of talent coming back, and it's a lot of young talent, and you would have really been left with, at the time, you could make outside additions or whatever, but nobody with much experience beyond like one season of making starts in the big leagues. Now, if you do happen to trade Freddie Peralta, and that was always going to be dependent on the return too. The return could have included somebody that would, follow that, like the Nestor Cortez part of the Devin Williams trade. Not saying that's the type of return you would be looking for Peralta, but that type of player could be included, like Taylor Rogers was for Josh Hader. Like, they have tried to, at times, bring back somebody who could help right away while also getting prospect capital as well. But I think it would have been harder to, one, and this is not their main concern, but convince the fan base that you are still trying to compete in 2026. If you lose both of them and you just go all young on the starting rotation side of things, I would have, in my eyes, they would have absolutely still been trying to go win games and compete for the playoffs. But I think that's always a tough line to walk for a lot of fans. And it can be, I mean, we've seen it the last couple off seasons. It was, they're not trying. They traded Corbin Burns and they go out and they make the playoffs, and they're trading Devin Williams. That one was a little, I think, more widely accepted by the fan base. People didn't love their return. And I think Durbin worked out a lot better than us and most people were expecting him to in his rookie season. But I think this makes it easier to walk that line if they get the offer that they feel like they can't refuse, because now you have that guy, that vet that can lead your rotation. Assuming he's healthy, there's still going to be that risk. But you have a guy that's slotted into the top of your rotation that has experience, that's been a very, very, very good pitcher in the league for a number of years. And you could do that without Freddie. You couldn't do that if Woodruff was gone, if he was on a different team. Like, that would be a lot harder to find or to even just imagine somebody in that role going into 2026. So I think what you said in terms of it being like an offer that teeters on that line, I do think this kind of swings it in the way of like, okay, this is a good offer. We are still going to have that guy at the top of our rotation. If we make this trade, we can do this now. And before, it might have been like, it's a good offer. We would be very close to taking it. We'd be interested. This is something that we would, in a lot of cases we might take, but given the circumstances and given that they are trying to compete in 2026, would it be enough to swing them? I think that would have been the question. And I do think in that way, it ups the odds of a Freddie trade ever so slightly. I do want to talk about, like, it's funny to me. I think I understand that, national media people are covering the entire league and covering a lot of teams, but the moment he accepted that qualifying offer, Woodruff did, it was just a bunch of people going like, oh yeah, Freddie's getting traded now. Like, this is going to heat up the market on the start. And it's like, that's not necessarily, I think they just kind of lump the Brewers into this, like, this is what they do when a guy's got 1 year of control, but they didn't do it with Willy Adames, and they haven't always done it. This is something they've done with a few players, and yes, they are willing to do it, but it's not an automatic. They don't just do it to do it. So that was a little funny to me. And then the other part of it was like, I think some people see those reports and start to assume like, oh, this means that the Brewers are shopping him. I think most of those reports are just reading tea leaves in the minds of a lot of the reporters. Like, if you read the wording from Jeff Passan, and Robert Murray talked about it, but you could hear it in the way he said it. Like, it's a educated guess on their part. Like, they are not hearing, from what I can tell and the way they're wording things, it does not sound like they're hearing like, oh, the Brewers are ready to move Freddie. It's, hey, it would make sense if the Brewers move Freddie. I still don't think they're going to. I've maintained that the whole offseason because I don't think they get that offer, that, Godfather offer that we've kind of been talking about. I don't think they'll end up getting that. But yes, just to circle it all back, like, I do think this up the odds just a tiny bit, because those 50-50 on the yes or no side of a trade, I do think that swung a little bit closer to like 60-40 yes or no if they get to that point with that type of trade.
Next piece of news that we have from this week, which is, I guess, not really news because it doesn't really constitute anything changing. The Brewers extended contracts to all of their arbitration eligible players, or I should say they tendered contracts, so they're going to continue going through the arbitration process. The only one who is now officially signed for 2026 is Jake Bauers. He agreed to a 1 year, $2.7 million contract, which is a bit above his projected $2 million. that MLB trade rumors had in arbitration. But we don't need to talk a ton about Jake Bauers, but I do think he's very, very interesting to watch going into next year because I know, at least speaking for myself, I've been pretty high on what Jake Bauers can accomplish if things click because I've always liked the raw power there and the bat speed and all of that stuff from the left side. There's always been a ton of thump in that bat, especially within the last couple of years after some of the changes he made when he was with the New York Yankees. It's always just come down to, can he make enough contact? And last year in 2024, it was not the case. For a good chunk of 2025, it was not the case. But as soon as he came off the IL with that shoulder injury, after he came back, which was mostly the month of September, he had an OPS well over 1,000 in September. Really good month. But not only that, his contact rate on pitches in the strike zone was about 90%. And he's never done that in a month of his big league career. So could that just be a flash in the pan? Yes. Could it be another example of Jake Bauers being very streaky? Because that's how things have gone for him the last couple of years. When it's good, it's really, really good. And when it's not good, it's really, really bad. That very well could be the case. But for him to come back and to make contact at a rate that he never has for a month-long stretch, let alone a month long, and this is also a month-long stretch where he was playing regularly. A lot of times he was not playing regularly for an entire month. For him to do that, to me, like it's very much something to watch because if he's at a point now where he's putting enough balls in play, he's always going to strike out quite a bit. But he rarely struck out in September. It was a pretty stark difference from what we'd seen before. But even over the course of a regular season, if the strikeout rate is down to 25% instead of like 35%, that's really all it would take because he doesn't chase. He's got really, really good plate discipline, exceptional swing decisions, a lot of power from the left side. This is a very good profile here if you can curtail the strikeouts a little bit. So I would imagine the Brewers are probably still pretty high on him too. There's a reason that they've kept bringing him back. But just to see that he was the one who settled, given how interesting, or he was the one who signed a deal already, given how interesting of a player he's probably going to be in 2026, I would not be surprised if the Brewers think that he's going to be a pretty big part of the middle of their order next year.
Yeah, I mean, especially as the stronger side of what I'm anticipating being mostly a platoon at first base, and Bauers having the ability to go to the outfield will help, I think, with getting him in the lineup at times. And pretty unlikely he'll see much time at DH, barring injury to a guy like Yelich or perhaps even, to an outfielder or something to force Yelich into the outfield a little bit more often. But either way, I think you're going to see, I think you're going to see a lot of playing time for Jake Bauers. And he ended the season with just a solid, obviously, the actual end of the season, he was fantastic, but the overall numbers are in a good spot for the season. Like, they're pretty good. And a lot of the peripherals, like you said, kind of took a step in the right direction, especially he always hit the ball hard. That was never really a question, but making more contact, it's never, like you said, going to be some, he's not going to become Luis Arias on pitches in the zone or anything. Like, this is not what he's going to become, and he shouldn't be because he hits the ball hard and he does damage. But I know he talked a little bit about changing the approach up a little bit, trying to flatten the swing out just a little bit and see the ball a little bit deeper. And I think in the smaller sample that we have of him trying to do that, especially in the second half, like after his injury, it was really good. And he added bat speed at the end of the season while doing that. So there's a lot of things that point in an upward trajectory for him. And we've talked about, like you said, you were right away when the trade happened for Bauers, talking about the upside that he has and that he possesses. And then in 2024, I think by the end of it, you were kind of like, okay, I'm not sure it's going to happen. And we all were like, there's just too much swing and miss, but that's what it was. It was just too much swing and miss. And if he's fixed that even to a reasonable degree, it's the same thing we've always talked about with Garrett Mitchell. It's the same thing as, we talked about with Oliver Dunn when we were still high on his potential, but he's the one of those three so far that seems to have potentially not fixed, but improved upon it enough to get to a point where it can make the profile not just work, but work really, really well offensively and be a power threat in the middle of a lineup that is going to continue to need people that hit for power, and it's going to still need to be something that they are looking for. It's going to be something that they're trying to seek out from, the non-Frelick, Durbin, probably Joey Ortiz types of spots in the order. Like, they're going to still be looking for people who can do that, and I think he's absolutely capable of it. And being a lefty, like I said, he's going to face a lot of right-handed pitchers, and he's shown that he can handle lefties too. So it's not like you'd have to necessarily yank him out of a game the moment a lefty steps on the mound either. Like, that gives him the ability to play full games, and it's not going to be great against lefties, and in big spots you probably don't want him facing them, but it's the strong side of a platoon. He's shown he can hit lefties. He's shown improved just peripherals and improved approach at the plate, and also, like we said, some bat speed and some swing path stuff. So there's just a lot to like with how he ended the season. And I did find it interesting that he got like 33% more than projected for arbitration. I always just find that interesting in general because they're usually pretty good. MLB Trade Rumors is usually quite good at being very close on the projections. The only thing that made it interesting for me is if that's a trend, if some of the other numbers end up being up across the league, it just made me think of the Contreras situation, which we can talk about in a second when we get to the players that were tendered deals but didn't sign anything. But the fact that if he goes up a little bit more, they're going to end up being pretty close to what the option was anyway. So that would be an interesting, it wouldn't matter that much, but it would just be interesting if they end up having to settle close to what they would have just picked up the option for. I don't really anticipate that happening, but it was just something that crossed my mind given it doesn't seem like a lot, and it's not a ton in the grand scheme of baseball money, $700,000, but it is a 33%, like I said, 33% higher than what he was anticipated to get. And that's a pretty big difference. That's not normally what you see from the projections that, like I said, they're normally pretty good.
As a reminder, some of the remaining figures for Brewers players who are eligible for arbitration: Andrew Vaughn's projection is 7.8 million. Contreras is 11.1 million, and that's on top of the $100,000 buyout for turning down his club option to go to arbitration instead. Trevor McGill, 4.2 million. Garrett Mitchell, 1 million. Bryce Terang, 4.4 million. And then Nick Mears, 1.6 million. Mears is still the interesting one on this list because I said this to you last night when we were prepping for this episode. And I'm just talking speculatively and based on analysis of where I think Nick Mears is at performance-wise. He feels like a potential tender and trade candidate to me because you look at the way his season went. He worked a lot early in the year. He had a rough second half where the control really went down in the wrong direction. The strikeout rate was down the entire year from where it usually is. The one interesting thing, though, is his fastball velo actually trended up as the year went on. In the second half, he was pretty much, I didn't even realize this, he was like kind of right back to where he was the previous year, sitting like 96.6. And some of the fastball whiffs came back, but it still got hit very, very hard when guys put it in play. There was a lot of damage against it, and more damage than the results would tell you there should have been. But he's just an interesting guy because it feels like someone who, 1.6 is still a pretty reasonable salary for a solid reliever. But do the Brewers think that this is maybe the time to flip him and try to get out before maybe some regression hits? And on top of this, he's out of options next year. And the Brewers, I think, would probably benefit from clearing one more spot in that bullpen where you can shuttle a guy up and down. Right now, the way that things shake out, yes, you can option Trevor McGill. Yes, you can option Jared Koenig. That's not going to happen, though, barring just unforeseen struggles by either one of those guys. So those guys are effectively out of options. And as you're kind of looking up and down the bullpen, you can still send Grant Anderson up and down. That's one. But then you've got two spots taken up by Nick Mears and Rob Zastryzny. And those are two veteran guys who are out of options who, you can kind of make a case either way. Like, do you need to have this guy in the bullpen next year? And I wonder if that's kind of where they're at with Nick Mears. So I would not be shocked if this is a situation where they tender him a contract, they try to flip him. But then if you're trying to flip him, do you try to reach a settlement with him before you do that? Or is there going to be a team that's actually going to want to take Nick Mears and then have to go through this process with Nick Mears after they acquire him? Or would a team prefer just a little bit more of the cost certainty and knowing that they don't have to go through this process?
Yeah, that is an interesting part of it. I think I'm with you 100% in terms of him being the one who was, if there was going to be a surprise non-tender, I think he was going to be the guy. We both agreed that it was more likely that a trade either happened, tonight. There are trades that happen on the day of the deadline a decent amount of the time for guys who are in that type of situation. Or like you said, you tender him a deal and either work it out and then make a trade, or make the trade and let them work it out. It does feel like, and you brought up the options. That was what I was going to go to too. Like combining the idea that there's a pretty decent chance the results are not going to live up to what they were in 2025. I think most analysis and just kind of looking into it at all would kind of point towards that being the case. Now, you never know what a guy's going to come back with. He showed better stuff when he first arrived in Milwaukee and had worse results, and that's just kind of how baseball goes sometimes. So maybe they think they'll get the stuff that he was showing earlier combined with maybe some of the improvements they had made in terms of command or whatever. But it does feel like they're going to want to open up a spot for multiple people who can go up and down throughout the course of a season, which they've always done. They've always wanted to do in their bullpen when they can. And he just feels like, to me, the guy that's kind of the obvious odd man out in that situation. Like you said, Rob Z could be another guy too. Like, just given the fact that, maybe Ashby and Hall are both in the bullpen, Koenig, like you do have a lot of lefties. Maybe they end up saying that's the guy they move on from. But I guess I'd put it that way. I would be a little surprised if both of them are on the opening day roster, barring, maybe there's an offseason injury and then it becomes easier to fit these guys in. But it just feels like they're going to want those spots to be able to move guys up and down, like a Craig Yoho and other guys who are, there's going to, even just talking about Woodruff before, like it might not even be the ability to move up multiple relievers. It might be, hey, we need to bring up a sixth starter this week so that we can try and help Woodruff get an extra day or skip a start. It could be stuff like that too. So having the flexibility to maneuver the roster because of optionable players being in your bullpen, I think that's something that's pretty important and something they probably might even put a little extra value on this offseason given those circumstances. So yeah, he feels like the guy that if you're going to see like a small trade, it's not going to be a big return. It's probably some lotto ticket or a somewhat interesting, arm in somebody else's farm system. But I could see that happening. I think it would make a lot of sense, and I'm sure he'll have interest around the league because he did have good results. He's shown good stuff. It's just a matter of, for the Brewers, is he going to be somebody who fits the roster? I think he'd fit plenty of rosters, bullpens as a fine piece in the middle innings. It just might be harder for the Brewers to fit him in moving forward.
Let's move on to awards season really quickly here. Unsurprisingly, Pat Murphy and Matt Arnold each repeated their respective awards. Murphy won Manager of the Year for the second year in a row. Arnold won Executive of the Year for the second year in a row. Not a whole lot to touch on here. We know that we know about the job that these two guys have done the last 2 years. The one thing on Murphy that I do want to revisit, because we talk about this all the time, you can say what you want about the on-field stuff, the strategy, the bullpen management, the win tonight, the aggressiveness, like all of that stuff, and we've talked about it plenty. But we have also always said that the one thing that there is very little doubt in my mind that he's good at is the interpersonal side of managing a ball club and managing a clubhouse full of competitive young men and getting them in a position to be in the right mindset to play good baseball. I think that's something that he's very good at, and we saw it again. So from that standpoint, I don't think you can argue too much with him taking home this award in back-to-back seasons. At the time, he was the third manager to win it in back-to-back years, and then Stephen Vogt joined him a few minutes later because he was also named the American League Manager of the Year back-to-back for him as well. But I know on that point for Murphy, I do want to go back to, I believe it was around the time that the Brewers were in Cleveland and Murphy had called like a second team meeting in 2 weeks second or third, one or the other. But this was also around the time that he was benching guys, and he was telling us in the media that the players had lost their edge, and it didn't seem like the players really agreed with that based on the way that they responded to those comments. That was definitely the one moment where I was starting to wonder, is this actually going to work, or is he actually about to lose these guys now? Because that's, and we did talk about it a little bit, like that you're walking a very fine line at that point, because then that's, he's always had a very college approach to it, but there was also something about that whole way of handling it that almost felt too college for a room full of adults. But again, I'm not in the room. I don't know how the conversations went. I don't know exactly what's said, but between all that stuff that was going on, I think it was fair to start wondering, is it for the first time, like, is he actually not pushing the right buttons here on the interpersonal side and from that aspect of it? But you can't argue with the results, I guess, because it was not immediately after those meetings, but they did turn it around and they started looking a lot more like the kind of team that they were the year before, and they ended up riding that wave to the best regular season in franchise history.
Yeah, no, I would echo all of that. I mean, it's we definitely, and we, like you said, we question plenty of the decision making during games and with pitching decisions and everything else. And, that's not just Pat Murphy's call, but in the end, it falls on him. He is the one who makes that decision, and he's the manager, and it's his final call, whether it's to listen to other people or to not. But like you said, this has always been the thing that we came back to, and we always talked about it being more important than game management is managing the clubhouse and managing the people and managing just the overall feel of the club throughout a season. And the first year, there was no question. Like, he was elite at it. There was no doubt that it was a huge part of what he was doing and what the Brewers were doing. But in that early May stint around Cleveland, and I think it was really San Francisco when the second meeting, and there might have been the third after that, I think it was 3, had happened, that we started pushing that a little bit more, like, okay, what is this? This is kind of his thing. This is the thing that he does really well. If this starts to fall off, then you probably start to have concerns about Pat Murphy as a whole, as a manager. And I mean, you can't really argue at this point. Like, he went out, and like you said, it was probably 2 weeks after that when they had, and you actually kind of pointed to, at the time, I remember Jackson Churio robbing the homer against the Twins as, like, if there's going to be a thing that sparks this team, that could be it. Yelich hits the grand slam against the Red Sox. That was a big moment in helping to turn things a little bit. And then I think it was the Pirates comeback in Pittsburgh where they were down in the 8th inning. They had really not hit all game, and then they put up like 5. And that was when they really just started going. But there were definitely, I think, fair questions about whether what he was doing was the correct thing for the team at that time, with the benching people, the team meetings. Like you said, I think we even talked about it at the time as being like, this feels like too college-like. But I think the thing you can always come back to with the Brewers is there's a decent amount of people who are not that far removed from college on this team. And I do think that may have been, even when he was originally hired, we talked about this a little, like, that might be part of the rationale in hiring him for this team, is that this is kind of the group of players he's used to play or coaching, like a lot of young guys who are scrappy and want to play hard and do all this stuff. And he brings the best out of them. And he showed that he could do it again this year. And it didn't look great early. And I think that says even more about his ability to make this work, that he was able to turn it around, because really in 2024, there was never much adversity that hit the Brewers. Like, yes, he did a great job keeping them up and doing all those things, but like, that wasn't that hard because they were mostly winning from the beginning of the season, and very rarely were they not in first place. But that was not the case early in 2025, and he showed an ability to right the ship, get things going in the right direction. And I would say between the 2 Manager of the Year awards, I actually think this is the one he earned more, just given what he had to go through. Like, this was a more difficult season for a manager to go through. And he did it, and he deserves a ton of credit for it. And it's well-deserved Manager of the Year award twice in a row. And as much as I wanted Craig Counsell to win them when he was the Brewers manager, it is so much funnier now that he did not win any of them as the manager of the Brewers. And then the first 2 years he was gone, his predecessor, who was also his college coach, won manager of the year. Yeah, no, that I enjoy that when I look back on it. But yeah, well deserved. And then Arnold, I mean, he's been unbelievable since he took over for David Stearns. I mean, it's just been a lot of pushing the correct buttons and maneuvering the roster in a way that I think it can be tough to see sometimes what the plan or the vision is, but the combo of him and Murph together with what the roster he's built and the type of roster that Murph does well with, I think they're working extremely well hand in hand, and that's how they both end up winning back-to-back years.
Speaking of roster building, a couple of very quick minor league signings that we both want to touch on. JB Bukauskas, he's back. Technically never really went anywhere. He re-upped on a new minor league deal. He missed the entire season after lat surgery. Still a guy, though, that I'm quite high on the stuff when he's healthy and what he's shown. Mid-90s sinker with a lot of depth to it, even more than you would expect from his slot. Good short slider that gets a ton of whiffs. He has not been on the mound often with the Brewers within the 2 years he pitched for them, but when he has, in like those 10 to 15 innings or whatever it's been a really, really good combination of ground balls and swing and miss. So I still like that profile a lot. Assuming that the stuff is going to look like it did before when he comes back, that's obviously the big thing to look for now. So I didn't check if I don't believe we know if there's a spring training invite or not. I would imagine he's going to be there in some capacity, though. So I think we'll get some kind of look on where the stuff is. But that would be a guy to watch going into next year still. The other part of this, too, is I have not done a whole lot of digging into this, but that fourth option, if I am doing my math correctly, that was never burned after it was granted because he spent almost the entire he wasn't in the minor leagues long enough for it to be burned in 24. And then he was on the big league roster, and then he went on the 60-day, and he missed the rest of the season. And then he was outrighted and re-signed and never made the club because he was hurt again. So to my knowledge, that fourth option has not been burned. But I don't know. I don't know if the rules are any different with that since it is different from the first three options. I haven't looked into the whole thing, but because if you look on Fangraphs, it says he's out of options on roster resource, which I don't know for sure exactly how that works because this is kind of a unique situation, but that would have some implications too, because, you know, if he is going to put himself back in a position where it looks like he can get outs in the big leagues, whether or not he can go up and down would probably play a pretty big role in whether or not he actually could land a spot.
Yeah, or at least the timing of when they might select him to bring him up. Like, it's more likely they're going to wait as long as they can if he doesn't have options to bring him up. But if he has them, then he could make the team out of spring without it being a surprise, assuming he's healthy and the stuff is where it was last. Like you said, this is a guy we both definitely liked. Like, I think well, I guess it was 2 years ago now, but it just, when he first was claimed, because he was claimed from the Mariners, if I recall correctly. It was just a pretty quick, like, oh yeah, there's some stuff here. And then we saw him in spring. Did you talk to him that spring a little bit, or?
Yeah, I talked to him
Okay.
before 25 or before 24.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So like just everything we were seeing and everything we were hearing, it all sounded pretty good. And he was on the big league roster early in the season, showing some good things, and you could see how it could work. But he just hasn't been healthy for basically 2 years at this point. So that's the question. Is he back to where he was? If he is, I agree with you. I think he's a major league pitcher. I think he's somebody who could help the Brewers bullpen. But then the options do become a really big part of it. Like that's a really big deal for a guy like him. And what we already talked about with the lack of optionable pitchers in the bullpen already, like, it's just going to make it more difficult for him to see the Brewers roster if he doesn't have that option remaining. I think the other part of that we should probably mention is that sometimes a minor league deal can be negotiated to not have the option anymore. Like, they can negotiated out of there. If it was, I'd be shocked if that happened, because I'm sure he knows that's his best chance at being on a big league roster, is if he has that option. But yeah, that would be something that would be good to know, I think, because it would really affect his likelihood or his potential of making the roster, especially early. Like I said, once you get to the middle of the season and you need relievers or something, like that's when you start to get a little bit more in the mode of like, okay, this guy's good enough to pitch in the big leagues. Let's see if we can keep him up. If he's pitching well, then we keep him on the roster. And if not, we have to end up DFAing him. And that's just the way it is. But if he has those options, like I said, it could be very early in the season that you see him again. And that would be, I think, ideal for the Brewers to have that flexibility. And I'm sure if it's out there, they'll probably take advantage of it if he is healthy, because the stuff will play at the big league level.
Another minor league signing we have in our notes, Eddie's Leonard. Spencer, you've got some notes on him, so I can let you run through that really quick and why you think that's an interesting grab.
Yeah, so Leonard was at one point a top 30 guy for the Dodgers in their organization, kind of across the board. Fangraphs had him, I think, 31, but everyone else had him in their top 30. He was a guy who at that time lacked power, actually. Like, he wasn't a great defender, but he could hold his own at middle infield spots, including shortstop. He was kind of average speed. Most people had like a 50 hit tool on him, but they had like a 40 power on his grading scale. And he went and signed with or I think he might have got traded to the Tigers organization. And suddenly the power started showing up for him. Max exit velocity last year of 114.5. 90th percentile exit velocity of 106 was in the 84th percentile for all of AAA. So a guy who at one point lacked power started showing it. Now, swing decisions, I think, are going to be the thing that the Brewers are going to hope to improve upon here. It's not a huge, terrible chase rate, but it's below average. He does not walk much. That was in like the 5th percentile for AAA last year, his walk rate of 7.2. But he does have good bat to ball skills. The whiff rate's a little higher than you would think, but he gets the ball in play. Part of his trade-off, and I was looking into this, part of his trade-off was a little bit of like the Sal Frelick thing we talked about this year, where in early counts, he's more willing to chase power. But he showed an ability to get the ball in play and not strike out a ton. That was only 19.1% this year. So in 2 strike counts, he seemed to shorten up a little bit, but he was willing to take bigger swings, and thus the whiff rate was a little bit higher. But I think it's honestly, and it's not a 1-for-1, and the ceiling's not as high, but it reminds me a little bit of what we saw with Andrew Vaughn when they brought Vaughn in. He hits the ball hard. Like, some of the peripheral stuff, he's underperforming his peripherals. He doesn't strike out an insane amount, but it's not a great bat to ball profile. But the biggest issue with Vaughn coming in was swing decisions and chasing too often. And I think that's a little bit of what you see with Leonard. And he just turned 25, like 2 days after signing this, or before signing this minor league deal. So relatively young guy. He showed a ton of positional versatility. He didn't play short this year. He played second, third, left, and right field. He's played some center field before. There's a lot of interesting things that, like, you get him to make a little bit better swing decisions and keep the power where it's now currently at. And he shows that he can handle second and third and the corner outfield spots reasonably. Like, that could be Andrew Monasterio, but with more power, with a little bit more to offer offensively, potentially. Obviously, we've talked about Monasterio, and he had a very, very good 2025. I'm still not sure I buy into a ton of it moving forward. But like, that's kind of what you could see here. Now, the thing with Monasterio is that, while I don't think he's a great shortstop, he can handle it. It sounds like, and it seems like, Leonard is kind of moved off of short, given he really didn't play it in 2025. But it's an interesting profile, and anybody who hits the ball that hard and doesn't have like insanely bad swing and miss rates, I think that's always going to be an interesting profile. And like I said, he kind of underperformed put it this way, his weighted on base average in AAA was in the 25th percentile and his expected weighted on base, or 29th percentile, and his expected weighted on base was in the 75th percentile. So it wasn't a huge difference. It was only 20 points, but still you can see where he underperformed in some ways. And yeah, somebody who can impact the ball and play a bunch of positions. I think that's always going to be somebody that I'm pretty interested in.
We got a few listener questions we're going to take here for this week. We'll start with Mason, who, like Spencer teased earlier, asked about Aaron Ashby's role. He asked, why would the Brewers even mess with stretching out Ashby as a starter? To me, it seems he fills a really good role in the bullpen. We have 4 starting pitchers who have a clear spot and 4 more eyeing the 5th one. The risk reward just doesn't seem to make sense for me. A clear, consistent role could serve him well. So I think a big part of this is how easily Ashby has slid right back to the bullpen. Every single time that they've tried this, we're on like 3 times now where they've tried the starting thing. And as soon as it stopped, he went to the bullpen, and within like 10 days, he looked amazing. I think if he struggled to transition back and forth, that might make it a little trickier to do this. But I think since they know that he can just go right back in there and it's not going to mess with anything, everything is going to look the same way it always has out of the bullpen. I think that's a pretty big part of the whole decision making process, because when you talk about risk reward, I think that really minimizes the risk. It mitigates the risk, the fact that he can go right back and do that. Now, there's honestly, I think the biggest risk is the injury thing, which is what happened last year when they tried it. But that was also a soft tissue injury that just kind of happened to happen on a pitch that he threw in spring training. So I don't know if that really would have mattered if they were stretching him out or not. I think the biggest thing here is they're just going to stretch everybody out that they can for depth purposes. So I'm sure Ashby's going to get stretched out. I'm sure DL Hall is going to get stretched out. I think anybody who's got the ability to give them some length is probably going to they're going to build up that way in spring training. And then if they don't need it, you can always shorten guys back up. The other part of this too is that the reality is Ashby is still throwing 5 pitches out of the bullpen. So he looks, he has the starter's arsenal, and a little wrinkle that he really used a lot more in the playoffs was he brought the 4-seamer back like big time. He was throwing it a lot in the playoffs, which was something that I kind of highlighted like right at the end of the regular season, because he had a couple outings toward the end of September where he mixed it in a little bit just to go at the top of the zone. And it's a really bad pitch on its own, but just the fact that it's different from his sinker and he can use that up. So I did point that out, saying, I wonder if he's going to do this more in the playoffs. And he did it a ton in the playoffs, which is, we've talked about this before. Guys, a lot of times will go into the playoffs wanting to show you something new that kind of goes against the scouting report a little bit, just to give themselves kind of a leg up. But if he does have that back and he's comfortable with it, that's something he can also mix in as a starter. But if it's sinker, 4-seamer, curveball, slider, changeup, and really out of all those pitches, the 4-seamer is the only one that doesn't grade well, you know, I can understand why you continually have that temptation to put that guy in the rotation. And then there's the mix of ground balls and strikeouts that we've talked about. Like there basically are there's like a very small number of pitchers who do that out of the bullpen. For guys who have actually had a decent workload, I think it's just Ashby and Duran from Philadelphia. Yep. I think those are like the only 2 guys who have that combination of striking out that many guys and getting that many ground balls and the balls put in play. That's something that if you can get that in a starting role, that there are no starters who do that. So it's a very unique skill set and a very unique ability that he has. So I think those are all the reasons why it's hard to quit the idea of Aaron Ashby as a starter. Do I think he's actually going to start next year? No. But I do think that they're going to stretch him out. Just that's my educated guess. And I think I'm okay with them doing that. I think that probably is the right call.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. Just to add a couple other parts of the equation here, like this is not a big part of it, but they did give him the extension that they gave him with the idea that he might be the idea at the time was that he was going to be a good starter by the end of the contract. There are 2 team options in 2028 and 2029. He's not getting $9 million picked up in 2028 if he is not starting. But if he is starting and shows that he can be a good starter, that's not a very bad deal for a starter. So I think there's an element of like, hey, if we can turn him into a starter, like we can get more value out of this contract that we gave him, then we're probably going to get out of it right now. And I don't think that's a big part of it, like I said, but I think it factors in a little bit. And then the other part, and this is where I more just with you, Jack, in terms of like kind of disagreeing on the risk reward part of it, of the question. For me, like the reward is it can be a really good starter. Like there's a ton here if he can put it together. And I don't think the odds of that are crazy high. I don't think they're very high at all. But it's one of those things that I would really hate to miss out on if it is in there. And the risk being other than injury, which is part of it, but I think we're far enough removed in the fact that he could just apparently throw every single day, no matter what, down the stretch of the season, says enough about where he is currently health-wise. Not to say that'll continue, but where he is right now, I think he's clearly far enough removed from his past injury to say that that portion of the injury isn't going to just immediately snake bite him at any point right now. He could re-injure it or have a different injury, but I think he's past the point where it would be considered any sort of setback or anything like that. So at this point, the risk is, yeah, he just really struggles to go back to the bullpen. But we've seen, like you said, multiple seasons where that hasn't been an issue for him. He can make that move really no problem. So I guess to me that leads to very little risk with actually quite a bit of reward. Like I said, the likelihood of that reward actually being realized, I would not put it very high. But it is something that I think if you do end up getting that, you can get, again, you get more value out of the contract you gave him. Even just 2027, he's going to be making 7.7 million. Like that's more than they usually are paying relievers. So at some point it gets tough just in terms of how the Brewers operate with bullpen pitchers, especially. Even just paying him that type of money to be in the pen, like it can be a little difficult. They'll be willing to do it if they have to do it, but I think if they can avoid it and get a really high upside starter out of it, I think they should continue to try it. Now, if it doesn't work this year, I think going into 2027, you're probably done with that attempt. Like at this point, it would just be too many times. But given the fact that he's been dealing with injuries and other things the last couple times, let's see if he can get a healthy spring and get through it and see if it works. And like you said, the other part of it is that they're going to want him to give them 2-3 inning stints out of the bullpen at times anyway, maybe even a little bit longer early in the season if he has been stretched out in spring. So it gives them a little bit more flexibility out of the bullpen either way if he's stretched out. But the upside is that there's a lot to like there if he can somehow put it together command-wise. And yeah, again, odds of that, probably not very high, but odds that I would be willing to see if it can work out, I think.
Lance asked us on Twitter, there were reports that the Brewers were interested in the Marlins middle infielders at the trade deadline. Could Otto Lopez be a trade candidate? Spencer, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that is a name that you've brought up before.
I think we got asked about him around the deadline, so we talked about him. I think we got a question about him around the deadline, so we talked about him a little bit. But he's interesting. I think for me, and I haven't looked at him super recently. I was trying to pull him up right now as we speak. But I think we had kind of settled on like the defense at short being a little bit of he's been very, very, very good when he's been playing second base defensively. I think the question of whether he could handle short is a different question. And then he just didn't, for us, when we talked about it, like he doesn't really bring anything different to the table offensively than what the Brewers have. It's kind of the same type of thing. Now, he was better than Joey Ortiz last year, obviously, offensively. But just the overall profile is very similar to what they have in those spots in that middle infield. Now, Bryce Turang has kind of changed that math a little bit with his power increase since the deadline when we were talking about all of that. But if he's out there and they're willing to move him for like a very reasonable price, I'm sure the Brewers would have some interest. But in the end, I would guess they're more willing to bank on Joey Ortiz just being as good or better than Otto Lopez next year. And they already know he can play short at a really high level. To me, that would be a little bit of a surprise. Like, he makes some sense. I don't think it's a bad idea by any means, but my guess from the outside is that the Brewers would say the cost to get Lopez is not worth the likelihood that he's actually better than Joey Ortiz, which I would guess they don't think is all that high.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think we had pretty much said that he would be redundant to some extent on
Yeah.
their roster, and I just looked it up again. I would echo that again because it's a guy who just there is a little more pop in there than we've seen like from Ortiz consistently, but in a lot of ways the skill set is exactly what they have. At that point, do you really want to pour resources into bringing in something that you already have, or do you just bank on the guys who are already very similar to that, just playing a little bit better? And I would guess that that's probably the direction that they want to go, especially because this is a front office that can be very confident in its own guys sometimes. Final questions that we got this week came from Chris, who, speaking of Bryce Terang, asked, "What do you think a Terang extension would look like, and how likely do you think he is to sign one?" So we can kind of go into the whole song and dance here. I think the time to sign him was actually probably after last season to really get the best arrangement. Maybe he's still open to it, but he feels so close to a breakout that I wonder if his camp is very content to just stick with the ARB process, thinking that he's going to have a very good season that is going to get him a very big raise instead of kind of locking into something right now. I don't know how you feel, Spencer, but that before we like even talk about contract terms, that's my educated guess on it.
Yeah, I think we were asked about who we would extend either in last offseason or during last offseason or like super early this year. And we both agreed like Terang was the guy on the big league roster that would make the most sense because there was the potential for the power to start showing up. Because if you remember, it must have been early in the season.
It was early in the season, I think, after we saw some of those
Yeah,
developments. I think
he started
in a
showing
way
some,
it almost hurts that some of those things actually started showing up in the game when they did, because if they didn't quite show up in games yet this year, then I think it would be even easier to say, "Yep, do it right now," because it's
yep.
about to happen, but it already started to happen.
Yeah, right. I think that's exactly where I was going with it. Like, this is unfortunate to a degree because the timing of it would have worked out better if he had this true power breakout in April of next year and they had gone in the offseason thinking, hey, we can you're not trying to trick the player or do anything, but like in terms of the player's going to have something to stand on when he tries to argue his side of any sort of contract negotiation. And yes, he could point to peripherals, but it's a lot easier to point to a huge power outbreak in numbers that actually happened in the offseason when you're trying to talk through these things. So, yeah, I'm with you. I think it's not super likely at this point, but I will say, I mean, you never know. Agents and the people on, like you said, in his camp can be really big parts of the equation here, but you never know with a guy like Terang, who seems to be kind of a quiet guy, probably likes the life that he lives in Milwaukee. Like, he could be somebody that knows that he might be getting a little bit less than he would if he just continues to play out a contract or arbitration and everything and just likes the situation he's in and is willing to do that. But I wouldn't ever know that. That's just speculation. So based on what we do know, it does feel a little less likely that it would happen now than, like you said, if we had done it last offseason, or even they don't really do in-season extensions very often in MLB in general, but if they had done it early in the season, as seen it as an opportunity maybe to try and jump on it in May or something and see if you could get it done then it might have worked out better. But yeah, now it feels like it's going to be a little bit tougher to find a agreement between both sides that would make sense.
I would have to look like for comps too of a guy at this stage in his career, and I don't even know if there are a ton right now. Like he just turned 26, and he's kind of right on the verge of this happening. My gut is telling me other guys have signed before that when they were still a little like he's in this weird spot right now where it's okay, you extend him. Will he take an extension that still gets him to free agency at like age 31? Or does he want an extension that's going to go through that free agency and give him a big payday? Like, if he is okay with hitting free agency in a few, like kind of right around his 30s, would he take like a 100 or something? I don't know. But to me, that feels kind of like at the very least, I would imagine with the caliber of player he is already, like this is a guy who he had basically back-to-back seasons that average out at like 5 wins above replacement. Like he's going to want probably $20 million annually at least. Like they're not going to sign him to one of these, 5 or 6 year and he's only making 12 to 15 million a year. Like I think that's already out the window. So it's going to have to be a little bit more substantial already. And then again, does he want to hit free agency around 30 or would he rather just ride things out with where they're at now and see if he can hit a couple years earlier? I don't know. Do you do something to buy out some arb years? Maybe. But again, I just feel like there's a lot of things pointing to him being in a spot where I don't know if the ship has completely sailed, but I think the highest likelihood of it happening was probably last year.
Yeah, I agree. I think if you're looking at current big leaguers now, like if we were asked that same question now, who would be most likely? And at the time, I think we both agreed it was pretty much just Terang that would make much sense. I'm not sure I would be on the side of like being super pro this extension, but I do wonder if Frelick would be more likely or somebody that they'd actually look at this offseason, just given I think the nice part with Frelick that you would have in any extension is that there is going to be a pretty nice floor no matter what with him, just the way he plays and the defense that he brings and the speed and everything else. Like there will be a floor, but the upside play was always going to be Terang. And yeah, like you said, I don't know if the ship has completely sailed, but I think it's making its way out from the dock. Like I don't think there's very high likelihood of it happening at this point. So yeah, it's kind of unfortunate. They may have missed the window, but it's also a good thing for the Brewers and Terang that he had the breakout and that we have seen that he is capable of doing this at this point too.
Yeah, for sure. I'm just trying to look at honestly, like Ketel Marte is the one that's like immediately on my head, and I looked at it, and this is still like he signed. It was a way smaller contract before he really broke out, and he's signed a couple different extensions now,
right?
But it's yeah. So I mean, he took a pre-arb deal that went from 2028 through 2022. That was a 5-year, 24 million. So that was before he was really established as. But again, they got out on top of it a little bit because they took that after. He signed that after first season in Arizona, where in 73 games, he had a 740 OPS and he hit 5 home runs. So again, that would have been like the equivalent of signing it last year for Bryce.
Right.
And Marte was also younger too when they did that deal. So it's just that it's hard for me to find one that really stands out as like, yep, this is kind of a direction they could go. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's just my best educated guess. Next question from Chris is, who do you think is the best prospect the Brewers will seriously entertain trading this offseason? I feel like I should hand that one off to the prospect guy.
It's a good question. I mean, it's just tough because it just depends on the level of player that you are in discussions for. Like it's going to be a sliding scale of any sort. I think there's one untouchable and there's no true untouchable, but there's one guy that you're not moving unless it's just an absolutely insane trade. And that's Jesus Mate. Like he's not moving. I don't think anyone comes across their table that they'd be interested in moving Mate for. Luis Pena, I think, would be somebody that they'd be willing to discuss in trades for those big fish. And like, again, I'm not talking about all of a sudden, I don't even know who a good example of this would be, but some super young player with a bunch of control comes across and it's a sure thing. You've got 6 years of control left. And yeah, maybe you move Mate in a package like that because he's more like the guy you're acquiring is like the high level version of what you're hoping for from Mate. But if it's one of those, 3 or 4 years left or an older player, I don't think that ever gets on the table. In the right move for an older player, like say this is actually something I thought about the other day. I don't actually think it'll happen, but say they actually do believe that Terang could play short and the Diamondbacks are moving Marte. Like I think the Brewers would be willing to, in the right circumstances where it makes sense for their roster, move Luis Pena for a guy like Ketel Marte. Like that's, I think, something they'd be willing to structure a deal around Pena for a guy like Marte, who's got, I believe on the current extension, he's got 4 years plus a player option off the top of my head. I was looking at it before. But I
Should
do
have said
know,
something when I had it pulled up.
I know
But
I was, but I believe it's like 16 million and then 12 million the next year as well. Like it's a little bit, and then it goes back to like 20 or something. But the part of that I found interesting was,
yeah, you're right about that. So yeah,
okay,
it goes down for a little bit and then it's backloaded.
and that the part that would be interesting for me, and again, I don't expect this to happen, but just how the Brewers have been willing to make trades for guys like this. His contract gets bigger. I think it would overlap with Yelich for 1 year, but the bigger part of it is after Yelich's would be off the books. So that would actually make it like, oh, maybe there could be a fit there if everything worked out. Now, I would not expect it. I don't really think you'll even hear about it, or I think there's a decent chance Marte doesn't even get moved in the end. But if they are shopping him, if the Brewers view Terang as a guy they can play at short, it would be a legitimately big upgrade to the middle of their lineup. Another guy, you'd have Terang wouldn't be at second anymore, but you have arguably the two best second basemen in baseball up the middle, and Terang being probably a pretty good shortstop if his arm can hold up. It would make sense for the Brewers, I think, in a lot of ways, but I just don't expect it to happen. The whole point of that, though, is that if that were on the table and they were into somebody like that, in talks for somebody like that, I don't think Mate would be part of that talk. I don't think they would include him in those talks. But I do think they'd include Pena and any other prospect in the organization in talks for somebody like that. So I guess the answer then is Pena for me. But it's an interesting thought. The other part of it is like the mid-range prospects, like or mid-range trade targets, like who's the best prospect you're willing to give up for a solid. I don't even know what the problem with the Brewers that we've talked about is that there's really not holes in the roster. And that if they do get a middle infielder, they're probably blocking Cooper Pratt and Jesus Mate in the next couple of years. So like it's hard to envision a big trade happening for the Brewers. So I guess maybe starting pitching where it's a more sure thing, that's maybe what they'd look at in a big deal. And who do they move in that? That I don't know. But I think if they go big fish hunting, big game hunting, big fish hunting, who hunts fish? If they go big game hunting, Pena is the guy that they would probably be not happy to, but willing to part with in a big deal.
As long as we're talking about prospects, do you have any prospect notes for us to close out the show?
Yeah, we'll do a quick one just based on the playoff games from the AFL. The Brewers on the surprise Saguaros, their team ended up winning the AFL championship. They had a bye, so they only played 2 games. It's just a 1-game elimination thing. And they won the semifinal pretty easily. Overall, in the 2 games that they played, Luke Adams went 2 for 5. He drew 4 walks and was hit by a pitch because he's always going to get hit by a pitch. It just has to happen. He's required to get hit by a pitch. That's why I love him. Josh Adamszewski, also 2 for 5. He drew 3 walks. And then in the 8th inning of the championship game, his team down 2 runs, bottom of the 8th. He had a ground rule double to drive in 2 runs to tie the game, and that actually kicked off a 7-run inning. So the Saguaros took what was a 2-run deficit going into the bottom of the 8th into a 5-run lead going into the top of the 9th to win the AFL championship. But there was a big hit from Adamszewski in that spot. And on the pitching side of things, the Brewers had a couple guys go in that one. Edwin Jimenez actually ended up getting the win in the game. He pitched 2 scoreless innings with 2 strikeouts. He entered in the top of the 8th, had a clean inning. Then he finished the game in the 9th after the Saguaros took their lead. And Jesus Broca also pitched in this one. He pitched 2 innings. He did allow an earned run in his 2 innings, but he struck out 3 to only 1 walk. That ended up including the playoffs and the regular season for the AFL. He pitched 11 innings. He struck out 18 and only walked 6. So another guy I've talked about a few times from the left side. I saw him in Appleton and kind of caught my eye when I saw him. And I wrote about him at Fanatic at the time as somebody that was like, oh, that's more than I thought was there originally. He had a velo jump this year. He got up to 96 after previously topping out in prior years at 92. Kind of sat 92 to 94 now. Two different. He's got the sinker. He's got the four seam. He's got a bigger breaking ball. And then he's got a really nice looking changeup too. I wonder if they're going to stretch him into a starter this year. He was kind of like a bulk reliever who went from low A all the way to double A this year. So 18 strikeouts to 6 walks in 11 innings. I think that was a really nice showing for him in what is normally a hitters league in the AFL. I think he went down there and did a pretty good job and showed some of the stuff that he was showing throughout the season was pretty legitimate because there's pretty good talent offensively in that league usually. But yeah, that was pretty much it. And I think that's either 2 years in a row or 2 out of 3 years the Brewers pitcher has closed out the final inning of a championship for the AFL. So clutch as can be in the AFL right there. They've got guys who get outs in big moments. But no, I mean, it is cool. Just generally, I talk about it with minor league games. Like when your players get the experience of playing in the playoff type atmosphere, it's not going to be the same with fans and everything, but the stakes are high and there are trophies and there are rings for the AFL that you get. So like there are stakes. And I think there's even some money involved, kind of like playoff shares. I don't think it's anything crazy, but for these guys, like some pressure, some added pressure to get that experience and play in a big game. Like I think that's always a good thing for them. And they obviously, the Brewers side of things, they all did a pretty good job handling it clearly.
Well, that's going to do it for us this week on the Brewer Fanatic podcast. We'll be off next week for Thanksgiving, and then we'll be back most likely December 5th, I believe, is the next Friday release date on the calendar. We'll see if there's any more news to break down when we get to that point. If not, we'll just continue taking questions as we always do. But regardless of what the discussion topic is next time around, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.